Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where are you, ladies and gentlemen, connecting from. My name is Jakub Nowakowski, and I'm a director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. And this is my privilege and honor to welcome you all this evening. Before we start, let's give half a minute to everybody who are still joining. So please stay with us, and we will be beginning in a very short moment. All right. So once again, welcome everybody. It is such a pleasure and honor for me to be welcoming and introducing a very special guest who is connecting straight from Poland, Konstanty Gebert. If there is a voice that you'd like to listen to understand what's happening in Poland, in Jewish Poland, but also beyond in Eastern Europe, but also in terms of Israeli history of Israel. If there is one voice from Poland that you would like to follow, I have no doubt that my recommendation would be to follow a voice of our today's speaker, Konstanty Gebert, who is one of the most prominent and influential Polish Jewish journalist, intellectual, writer. But Konstanty Gebert has also have had a very long involvement in the Jewish life in Poland. He was no doubt one of the architects of the revival of Jewish Poland. In the 1980s, he was the underground activist, creator of, or co-creator of Jewish Flying University, and a structure that was fundamental in creating fundaments for the revival of Jewish life in Poland. But he is also a journalist, a speaker, editor of Jewish magazine Midrash, and author of several books. And one of those books, The Final Solutions, Genocide Perpetrators and Their Work, it will be the subject of our discussion this afternoon. And before I will pass the floor to Konstanty, let me just say that this event is organized in collaboration with our partners, Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, as well as Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. And we have with us a director of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, Mary Kluk. Mary, would you like to say a few words? I know that you also have a history with Konstanty.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kuba. I am not able to open my video. I think the host is resisting that option. So if everybody doesn't mind, I'd look a little bit like the photograph on my screen. But just to say, oh, there we are. They've asked me to start my video. Thank you. Oh, technology is wonderful. Wonderful. Hi, Konstanty, and hi, Jakub. How nice to see you both. Thank you for this opportunity to say a few words of welcome to everybody. It's the first occasion where, since Kuba is the director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, we are working together as the SAHGF, having a joint function, which we do from time to time. And it's really wonderful that you've initiated this. Thank you so much, Kuba, and for bringing your very special guest, who I like to believe is now become a friend of mine too. We met in Srebrenica at the commemoration in July, and Konstanty had an enormous impact on me personally, so much so that I approached him to say, you really need to come to South Africa, as one does, particularly as South Africans are known to do. You, my community, my people need to hear from you. You have such a wonderful message. You are an incredible speaker. Your knowledge, your wisdom, your intellect, you really need to come to South Africa. He said, well, you know, in Konstanty's dry humor, we can discuss it maybe. And here we are, where you, Jakub, have arranged this as a first step, an online opportunity for our audiences to have this privilege. And hopefully in the coming months and possibly sooner, we can arrange for you, Konstanty, to actually visit us in person. It is a great privilege for everybody to hear from you. I'm sorry the circumstances are such that your area of study is so pertinent and so real and so raw for many of us. We pray for the people who are being held hostage at the moment in Gaza. We pray for victims on both sides. We pray for a steady and hopefully speedy resolution and peace in the region. And we're very grateful to have you and your wisdom to share with us at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And now, really, before I'll pass the floor to Konstanty, let me just say two other things, that this event is part of the program accompanying the Seeing Auschwitz exhibition. The exhibition has already been presented in Durban and in Johannesburg, and it's now in Cape Town. So if you haven't seen it, please visit us. The exhibition will be up throughout January 2024. And finally, I would like to also recognize Justine Hangunda, who is working on the technical sides of this Zoom. Thank you. And now, Konstanty, thank you once again for agreeing to speak to spend this evening with us, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuba, for the invitation, and thank you, Mary, for your very generous comments. And I very much cherish the memory of meeting you in Srebrenica. And it is indeed a place from which to reflect on what has happened with genocide in the modern world. Because one thing we know for sure, never again turned out to be a false mantra. It happened again. It is happening again. And the American journalist David Reef once famously wrote that, and he covered the Bosnian War as I did, he wrote, after Sarajevo, after Srebrenica, we now know what never again means. It means that never again shall Germans kill Jews in World War II. That's all that it means. So it's pretty obvious that as a civilization, we have failed in the attempt to stop genocide in its tracks. After the Shoah, it happened in Cambodia, it happened in Bosnia, it happened with the Yazidis under ISIS rule, it happened in Darfur, it happened in a different way with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and the ruthless slaughter of 1,400 Israelis at the hands of Hamas terrorists might well be considered an act of genocide. I hesitate to use this term because it's not up to us commentators. It's a legal term, and we need the ruling of a court of law to determine whether a particular massacre was in fact or not a genocide. But I'm sadly pretty confident that if this slaughter ever comes to court, the court will rule that it was an act of genocide the way that the slaughter in Srebrenica was an act of genocide. It is a testimony to the disastrous state of contemporary ethical reflection that we might think, we Jews, that recognizing the slaughter as an act of genocide is not necessarily something that we should want, for a very simple reason. If the crime of Hamas will be considered an act of genocide, political pressure will mount to recognize some Israeli act as an act of genocide in order to keep the balance between the two warring parties, as allegedly objective commentators say. The fact that the Hamas slaughter meets the requirements of what is legally considered an act of genocide, it is an attempt to exterminate in part or in whole an ethnic, national, religious, or racial group, and civilian victims of Israeli military acts, each one deplorable and not necessarily all of them avoidable, do not constitute genocide, since the objective is not to exterminate a group in part or in whole. This will probably have very little importance, since the world desperately wants to keep equal distance between victims and perpetrators, and not draw the conclusions that we should need to draw from the fact that a slaughter has been committed, which has the hallmarks of genocide. But genocide has always been politically ambiguous, indeed legally unclear. The very term, as you might know, was invented by the Polish Jewish lawyer Rafał Lemkin. And in the interest of full disclosure, my mother studied under Lemkin in Warsaw and thought very highly of him. So I actually might be slightly biased in favor of his work. But Lemkin was, in the legal world, the first to realize that the genocide of the Armenians committed by Ottoman Turkey in 1518 is not another big slaughter. It is something more. It is the conscious, intentional attempt to eradicate an entire people. Lemkin was a student of law at the University of Lvov, a city variously called Lvov, Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, that at that time was part of Poland and now is part of Ukraine. And he asked one of his law professors, well, why doesn't international law do something about a slaughter this huge? And the professor said international law has nothing to say about how a state treats its citizens. And the professor used an example. He said, a farmer owns chicken and decides to cut off their heads. It's his chicken. Nobody can intervene, nobody can complain. In the same way, the state is sovereign vis-a-vis its citizens, and if it decides to exterminate them, well, no crime has been committed. This was the state of legal affairs in the 20s. In fact, even after World War II, you might notice that at the trial at Nuremberg, prominent Nazis were condemned for crimes committed against populations of occupied countries, Jews included, but no verdict was handed down for crimes committed by Nazi Germany against German Jews. This was the sovereign affair of the state. Germany was free to treat its citizens as it so fit. Legal doctrine changed only afterwards, and Lemkin played a fundamental role in this change by coining and promoting the concept of genocide. According to his definition, genocide is, as I already said, but it's worth repeating, actions conducted in the intent to exterminate, in part or in whole, a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group. This is the only legal definition of genocide that exists in the literature. It is not a very satisfactory definition from a historical point of view. And indeed, more than 50 different definitions of genocide function in historical debate. But it has the value of being the sole definition that has the weight of international law behind it. So in my work, last year I published an 800-page long work that Kuba Nowakowski cited, Final Solutions with an S, the Genocidaires, the perpetrators of genocide, and their work. In that book, I use this particular definition precisely because it has legal standing that historical definitions do not have. The legal standing is due to the fact that the definition was integrated in the UN Convention on Preventing and Prosecuting Genocide, which was unanimously passed by all UN members in 1948. And that definition says, to repeat it once again, activity undertaken with the intent of exterminating in part or in whole a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group. Now, two elements of that definition are fundamental. One is, it is the intent that matters. Genocide is not just a very big slaughter. It is slaughter committed with the goal of removing a group defined in the definition from the face of the earth. Genocide is what happened to us Jews in the Shoah, but it also happened to the Roma in the Paraimus, which took place at the same time. It earlier happened to the Armenians in Ottoman Turkey, to the Herero and the Nama in present-day Namibia, then German Southwest Africa, arguably to Ukrainians in the man-made famine of the early 30s, and after World War II, certainly in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, the Srebrenica act of genocide, and the other more contemporary events that I had earlier mentioned. Any lawyer knows that proving intent is the most difficult part of any criminal trial. The accused will deny that the intent he is alleged to have had was really what motivated him, and largely it can be his word against the word of the prosecution, unless uncontrovertible evidence can be brought to bear. In the Srebrenica trial, the first person to be accused of genocide in Europe since World War II, General Stanislav Kristic, the head of logistics of the Drina Corps of the Bosnian Serb army, vehemently contested that facts occurred the way the prosecution says they occurred, that the Serbs, having taken the town of Srebrenica, went on to intentionally slaughter around 7,900 Muslim men and young boys. But then he said, okay, let's assume for the sake of the discussion that what the prosecution alleges, and which is fake, actually did happen. 7,900 victims. Is that a genocide? To which the presiding judge, Theodore Miron from the US, famously answered, and just how many would have satisfied you, General? And General Kristic abandoned this particular line of defense. So it is intent that counts, not absolute numbers, but the victims must belong to one of the four enumerated groups: national, ethnic, religious, or racial. Apart from the fact that the usage of the term racial group today sound surprising in legal language, since race is not a legal category. What is striking is the absence of social and political groups as possible victims of genocide. Since the definition does not list social and political groups, being slaughtered by the millions for who you are socially or what you stand for politically cannot be considered genocide. We have the Soviet Union to thank for it. The Soviet delegate to the General Assembly very clearly saw the danger if exterminating people because they belong to a social political group is genocide, then the Soviet Union can certainly be considered guilty of genocide. And he threatened that he will veto the convention if social and political groups remain in the definition. The Soviet position was surprisingly endorsed by Saudi Arabia. And because it was of such fundamental importance to have all UN members unanimously endorse the convention, the definition was cut and social and political groups were removed from the definition. This is why the Holodomor, the man-made famine, in which approximately 4.5 million Ukrainians found their deaths in the Soviet Union in the early 30s, is either considered or not considered a genocide, depending on how you interpret the event. The fact that 4.5 million people starved to death because of intentional decisions by the Soviet leadership is beyond debate. This is not what is being argued. The fundamental question here is, were those Ukrainian peasants starved to death by Stalin and his henchmen because they were Ukrainian peasants, or because they were Ukrainian peasants? If the first is true, if it was their ethnicity that determined Stalin's decision to starve them to death, this is a genocide. But if, in fact, Stalin didn't care about their ethnicity, but wanted to exterminate them because they belonged to a social class that, in his eyes, needed to be exterminated, the rich peasants, then it is not a genocide. I would say that the prevailing balance of historical evidence indicates that Ukrainian peasants were treated with much more concentrated hostility and malice than non-Ukrainian peasants. You can compare the death rates in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, all of them disastrous, but none of them approaching the death levels that occurred in Ukraine itself. And this, to me, is evidence that it was Ukrainian peasants that Stalin was after. But still, the debate about this, based on the UN definition, is legitimate. An even more striking example occurred in Cambodia, where in the 80s, a ruthless communist regime exterminated some 2.4 million of its citizens, mainly for political and social reasons. They belonged to social classes that the regime wanted to be rid of in order to build a better Cambodia, or they adhered to political beliefs like democracy that were incompatible with this better Cambodia. And given that, the fact that they were exterminated for belonging to social or political groups did not qualify as genocide. But then it turned out that the Khmer Rouge also exterminated Cambodian Muslims for being Muslim, and in fact, members of the Cambodian Vietnamese minority for being Vietnamese. And those two slaughters, numerically insignificant when compared to the number of non-Muslim and non-Vietnamese Cambodians slaughtered, enabled the accusation of genocide directed at Khieu Samphan and his henchman, Pol Pot, having died before the tribunal could convene. So we see how crucial the wording is and how difficult it may be to prove a genocide, even if the stench of the killing fields rises to high heaven. But I believe that the question of intent goes even beyond what the UN Convention says. And this is what really sets genocide apart from what we would consider a typical massacre. Massacre is what human history is made of. If we remove the massacres from human history, a very thin booklet remains. Genocide is a new invention. It necessitates the existence of a post-Enlightenment state and a completely new perspective on the state's obligations. Let's take a step backwards. When you read about massacres in history, you can read Tacitus or Thucydides from the Antiquity. You can read the story of the sack of Constantinople by the Turks. You can read accounts of the taking and pillaging of cities of the wrong religion during Europe's wars of religion. Regardless of the time period from which those descriptions come, they're all remarkably similar. It is what happens when a besieging army finally breaks through and takes a city. What happens is an orgy of violence, of murder, torture, rape, and pillage, and it continues unabated, usually for about 5 days. Apparently, many of us simply enjoy inflicting suffering and pain on other human beings. And this is what drives the perpetrators of mass murder and massacre. It is the physical enjoyment of torture and rape and the material benefit of pillage and looting. But there can be too much of a good thing. I mean, just how many people can you torture to death before you eventually get satiated and bored? Eventually, it comes to the moment when you no longer crave the pleasure that is given by the suffering of others. And if at this point there are survivors, you say, well, let them live, who cares? The génocidaire, this is a French word that has moved into the English language because English, surprisingly, does not have a specific term for perpetrators of genocide. This is mainly due to the fact that the British had never experienced genocide on their soil, so there was no need for the English language to produce a special word. But génocidaire, perpetrator of genocide, got a lot of usage after Rwanda. Rwanda was a Francophone country, and it has entered the English vocabulary, and I will be using that term. The génocidaire has a completely different approach to things. He takes no pleasure from the murders he commits. In fact, he may be disgusted by them. Some of you might have read Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. It is a monograph of German Reserve Police Battalion 101 from Hamburg, which in the summer of 42 committed mass murder of Jews in the occupied southeast of Poland, near Janów Lubelski, a small town in the boondocks. These were grown men, too old to serve in the army. This is why they were drafted for police work, married, with children, with regular jobs. They were clerks, tram drivers, engineers, serious, solid men who were sent to a foreign country to murder civilians they had never met. And they did. And they did. But they wrote back home just how hard the job is. That no matter how well you organize the execution, and this particular chapter in the history of the Shoah was committed by bullets. It's part of this genocide by bullets, which is still being explored. No matter how well you organize it, people won't stand where you tell them to stand. They'll move around. They'll get shot and not killed, but only wounded. You have to shoot them again. And no matter how good the precautions, you end up spattered with blood and brain. And this is Poland. There are no good showers, so there's no way to clean up, really. It's not fun. But somebody has to do it because it is the right thing to do. Because a better future for Germany is dependent on the extermination of the Jewish race. There is not one recorded case of any German functionary in the military, in the police, in the SS, who would have been punished for refusing to participate in the genocide. You could always opt out. And individuals occasionally did, then to suffer the ridicule of their comrades, not being manly enough, not being responsible enough, not supporting the team. That was a serious fear of losing your standing in the eyes of your peers who did the dirty job because it needed to be done. So this is why ordinary men from Hamburg, good husbands and fathers, went on to murder the Jews. And because they felt no pleasure, they also felt no guilt. Mass murderers often, not always, but often, reach a moment later in their lives when they actually feel pangs of conscience for the crimes they had committed and try to produce some kind of moral atonement. In the Middle Ages, they would join monasteries, donate their riches to the poor. In more contemporary times, they would go on humanitarian missions to do some good to try to compensate for the evil they've committed. Génocidaires do not have this problem. They do not think they have committed evil. They think they have done a good thing. They can only be sorry that they were not successful enough. And they die with a clean conscience in their beds, not a pang of remorse. In Rwanda, an elderly génocidaire told me that slaughtering a human being is hard work. L'homme, monsieur, est un grand animal. Human beings are big animals, he said. It takes a lot of chopping to make sure that they're dead. But, the gentleman went on to say, I am a serious person. I cannot refuse to do my part when everybody else is doing the hard work to ensure a better future for our nation. I would lose my self-respect. The génocidaire is not somebody who is driven by base instinct, by the lust of blood and rape and murder. The génocidaire is an idealist, a moral person paying the hard price for making the world a better place. But why is a genocide necessary to make the world a better place? Well, this has a lot to do with what the modern state is all about. Until modernity, nobody thought that the state has obligations to its, not even citizens then, but subjects. The state were the thugs that people paid to protect them from even worse thugs, right? This was all the state was supposed to do. And then the Enlightenment happens. And the Enlightenment teaches us that states indeed have obligations to citizens and subjects. They need to educate them, to provide health care, to build bridges, to build roads, to improve the life of the poor, to educate the unwashed masses. And all this is hard work, but it is building a better future. But what happens if there is a recalcitrant, people who do not fit in this vision of a better world? In Rwanda, the Hutu power nationalists explained that the Hutu can never be free as long as the scheming Tutsi are around, ready to undermine any efforts at Hutu emancipation. If the Hutu are to be free, the Tutsi have to go. And another genocidaire in Rwanda once asked me, you know, sir, how we call them? Inyenzi, cockroaches. You think that happens out of nothing? And let's be frank, sir. Would you like to share your house with cockroaches? Well, you see my point. I too have the right not to want to live with cockroaches. And if the cockroaches will not remove themselves on their own, well, I am entitled to take the steps I need to take to make sure that we're rid of cockroaches. This animalistic language is highly characteristic. It always is the first step of genocide, the dehumanization of the future victim. Hitler very much liked to use the metaphor of the Jewish microbes that attack the healthy body of Europe and therefore need to be exterminated to protect the health of the European true Aryans. In one of his texts, Hitler wrote, criticizing German emotional anti-Semitism, he said, this is wrong. We should not be driven by a hatred of the Jews. We should rather be like the medical doctor who does not hate the bacillus of tuberculosis, but kills it to protect a superior life form, the human the bacillus has attacked, from an inferior life form, the bacillus itself. In the same way, we need to exterminate the Jewish bacillus, not because we hate it, but because we opt for the higher life form against the lower. As an aside, I might say that it's interesting that in right-wing genocides, this metaphor of noxious life forms is very typical. It's repeated. They can be bacilli, they can be cockroaches, they can be vermin, but these are noxious life forms that need to be exterminated, animal life forms. In left-wing genocides, as in the Holodomor, as in Cambodia, the dominant metaphor is one of weeding the garden. And this is interesting in its own right because it shows a different sensitivity towards genocide. The right-wing view on genocide is very straightforward. All it takes is to exterminate the brutes, and then the true humans will thrive. Not so, say left-wing génocidaires. It is not enough just to weed the garden. There needs to be a gardener who will continue taking care of things to make sure that the wrong plants do not reappear, but the right plants will thrive. Interestingly, also in both kinds of genocide, the medical profession is often very actively represented. In the Turkish genocide of Armenians, some of the leaders of the genocide were medical doctors who explicitly made reference to their medical profession as the guiding light that directs them in this difficult but necessary work of liberating Turkey of the Armenian parasites. In Germany, the medical order joined ranks with the Nazi Party, purged itself of Jewish parasites, then went on to exterminate German terminal patients and the entire T4 program, where incurably ill were exterminated because they were not living a life worth living, as the Nazi language had it. All this was done by good German doctors from good German universities. This we need to remember when we try to think of genocide as some kind of descent into barbarism, throwback to the Middle Ages, whatever. Nonsense. It's an extremely sophisticated and specialized program thought up and realized by intelligent people who know exactly what they're doing and why. And the biggest threat that genocide constitutes resides in the fact that all the institutions that are needed for genocide already exist in a post-Enlightenment society. All it takes is for those institutions to be hijacked and perverted. General Roméo Dallaire, the Canadian general who was the commander of the UN troops in Rwanda during the genocide that was prevented by his political masters from preventing the genocide or intervening as it was happening, wrote in his fundamental work, which I very highly recommend, Shake Hands with the Devil, that in February 94, they started getting information that the Rwandan Ministry of Education was demanding that teachers draw up lists of their students by class and by ethnicity, Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa. Now, in fact, the three groups are not ethnically different. That's not the point. There are other social castes than different ethnicities, but that's not centrally important for this element of the story. And Dallaire writes, well, we thought it's bizarre, but so much was happening, we didn't pay attention. And yes, the genocide started 2 months later. And I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a Rwandan teacher who gets the circular from the Ministry of Education saying that you need to draw up the lists. Looks stupid. Why should the ministry need to know the group identity of my students? But okay, hey, first stupid circular I got from the ministry. And actually, there might even be a valid reason. Maybe they want to compare educational outcomes. Maybe say the teaching of physics among the Twa is lagging behind and we need to take corrective action. Anyway, it's not my headache. They have the right to ask. I'll just draw up the list and send them to the ministry. What the teachers did not know is that they were drawing up death lists, kill lists. Because while in Rwanda, some people look physically very Tutsi and others look very Hutu, most look, well, Rwandan. You could tell who is who by checking people's identity papers because they had their group affiliation filled out in the identity card. But you got your identity card at age of 18. Children did not have identity cards. So for the killers to know which children to kill, they needed those kill lists produced by the children's teachers. And this is what I mean by saying that the institutions needed for genocide are incipient in the heart of modern Enlightenment society. And don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a wonderful thing. The Enlightenment gave us democracy, free education, universal health care, and the possibility for me to address you via Zoom half a planet away. The Enlightenment is a wonderful thing. But wonderful things can also be abused. And this Enlightenment vision that society needs to be transformed, modified, and led towards a better future can directly lead to crime. So I'm thinking, if I were this Rwandan teacher, I would like to think that I would say, hell no, I'm not giving them any list until they tell me what they need it for. They convince me that this is right and just and appropriate and safe. And unless this happens, I'm not telling them anything. We all know such people. We've all worked with such people. They're an unspeakable pain in the neck. And when the institutions throw them out, everybody has a sigh of relief and gratitude. And yes, indeed, institutions cannot function if they need to justify each act they undertake to every employee that is under their command. So those pains in the neck in normal contexts are just that. They are an impediment to normal functioning. And then when push comes to shove, they actually save humanity. I have the immense privilege of knowing Polish righteous Gentiles. And I tried to find out what made them different. The Polish righteous Gentiles had their Polish neighbors to fear, not the Germans. The Germans didn't go house searches looking for Jews, and as often as not, they couldn't tell Jews from other Poles. But Poles did. It was their neighbors they were afraid of, and not only of denunciation, but of the contempt. You're helping enemies of the Polish nation. And yet they did it. Against those unspeakable odds, taking unimaginable risks. They risked their lives to save often strangers. And I spoke only to those who managed to survive. Those who were denounced and murdered did not live to tell their story. They didn't have any of the normal socioeconomic attributes in common. They could go from illiterate prostitute to professor at the university, left to right. They could be bigoted Catholics or just as fanatic communists. The one thing they had in common, just one, was their impossibility of allowing themselves to be convinced, even convinced by themselves, that it's not their business. Once they saw that people are being wronged and harmed, they found it impossible to turn away. They actually thought that the entire world is their business. And all of us know people who are alive because they had the blessing of running into one of those caravans. And one of them, one evening, were sharing shots of vodkas and long stories. He once told me, look, I'll tell you because I think you will not misunderstand. You know those Jews, and he as a teenager helped his mother save a neighbor and her teenage daughter. You know those Jews we saved? I didn't even like them. That's not the point. And then he got terribly afraid that by saying he didn't like those Jews, he'll be accused of anti-Semitism. So he made me promise that I will never quote him by name. And he's since passed away, so I cannot be released from that promise. But of course he was right. Liking or not liking has nothing to do with it. It will be unacceptable for human survival to depend on whether somebody likes us or dislikes. The idea is that when one human being is wrong, humanity is wrong. And if I am humanity, I am wrong, and therefore I need to take action. The righteous person is the physiological opposite of the génocidaire. The génocidaire might even in the abstract consider, well, yeah, quite possible that those Jews or those Hutu, those Tutsis or those Armenians, they might actually suffer. Well, there's a price to be paid for building a better world. And the righteous person will say, no. There cannot be a better world if it's built on even one individual's suffering. Those two views are incompatible. And the practical question is, how do we make the world slightly safer for the righteous? Because it's not a safe place to be. Not for the righteous who saved Jews in occupied Europe, not for the Hutu who tried to save their Tutsi neighbors, not for the Turks who refused to slaughter Armenians living next door. This is a very unsafe place to be in. But we need to increase the numbers of the righteous if humanity is to have a chance. And the only instrument I have discovered that actually works is teaching our children disobedience. No, I don't mean the ordinary kind of disobedience. I have 4 children. God knows they don't need any teaching to be disobedient. But it is the disobedience that happens when you have to uphold what you believe is right against the entire planet, if need be. Imagine Poland under German occupation. Poland was invaded by an army of Goethes and Beethovens, by the army of the most advanced country on the face of the planet. Everybody wanted to be German. And if this most advanced country has made it a priority to exterminate all the Jews, well, maybe we should sit up and pay attention. Maybe they have a point, especially as they're willing to exterminate those Jews, even to their own detriment. Summer of 1944, when rolling stock was desperately needed by the German army to transport troops to the front lines. The Eastern Front was breaking down under the Soviet offensive, and the Allies had landed in Normandy. Still, transporting Hungarian Jews to the gas chambers of Auschwitz had top priority. The army could wait. So you have this most advanced state on the face of the planet risking its very existence in order to exterminate Jews. Maybe they have a point, especially as the heavens did not darken. The parish priest did not condemn this. The Pope in Rome didn't condemn. Soviet Russia was supposed to be a Jew communist state. Starting 1943, the Soviets had Treblinka in the range of their airplanes. Not one Soviet bomb fell in Treblinka. Starting in spring 1944, the Western Allies had Auschwitz in the range of their bombers. And yes, Allied bombers did fly over Auschwitz, very low because they were very heavy with bombs, that they would drop over the chemical plant at Monowitz, 8 kilometers from the main death camp at Auschwitz. Not one bomb fell on Auschwitz or the tracks leading to it. So if the entire planet seems to be in agreement that killing Jews is a desirable thing, it will ensure a better future. And none of those who you'd expect to oppose it actually take a stance. So who am I, the one sole individual, to tell the world it is wrong? And yet, my drinking friend, as a teenager, very consciously risked his life to save people he didn't even like. This is the disobedience I'm talking about. If we can teach our children to trust their moral guts, not to give in, even in the face of seeming unanimity, we probably will not give them great career prospects. They will probably not climb the corporate ladders. But just possibly, they might make a difference where it matters. The difference between life and death, which is the difference between I don't care and it is my business. So never again is a false mantra. It has happened again. It is happening again. It will happen again. But the one thing we can still try to say is not with my consent. And this starts very early. And with this, I'd like to conclude. I've taken up too much of your time already. Inge Deutschkron was a Jewish teenager in Berlin. She survived hidden by German families. And she told me a story from pre-war Berlin, already Nazi, but pre-war, about a relative of hers who was a German office clerk. And true to his vocation, he worked like clockwork, and at noon he would stop, take a lunch break, and then go to a park and sit on the bench and feed the birds. And this is what he did for 20 years, right? And then one day, benches in the park got captions. Nur für Deutsche, nur für Juden. And he just sat on the same bench he used to sit on for the previous 20 years, started feeding the birds, and this sweet old lady passes by, and she says she recognized him as a Jew because she knew him from the office, and says, "Oh, sir, you've made a mistake. This is not your bench. Your bench is over there." Now, I'm pretty sure this sweet old lady didn't have one mean bone in her body. All she cared was for people to follow rules, right? If that gentleman would have been littering, she would have said, "Oh, sir, you dropped something." If somebody had told the sweet old lady that by pointing to this Jew where his bench is, she had set the trains to Treblinka in motion, she first wouldn't understand. Nobody knew about Treblinka. Even Hitler and his henchmen did not yet have the idea of Treblinka in their minds. And had somebody explained to her what Treblinka will be, well, she'd be outraged. But this is what makes genocide possible. It is our unlimited trust in the state and in the idea that they have the right to do what they do. This is the Rwandan teacher drawing up lists. It's the old lady in the Berlin park pointing the Jew towards his bench. And the only answer to that is this teenager in Warsaw who helps people not because he likes them, but because he cannot stand the idea that he refused to take responsibility. If we raise our children in this spirit, we will not prepare them for easy lives. But just possibly, somebody might owe their lives to them. And I think this is a worthy gamble. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kostek. It was, as always, extremely thought-provoking and meaningful speech. Thank you very much. And the book that we've been referring to is still in Polish only. As Kostek told me before we started, it's now being translated, or that the work is being done on the German version. So please stay on lookout, and hopefully soon enough we will also be having the English version. If so, we'll be the first one to organize yet another meeting and book promotion with Kostek. Hopefully in person, but hopefully sooner we will see you, Kostek, here in South Africa for a grand tournée throughout all the three centers. But before we will let you go, if you still have 1 minute to answer a question that came in.
Certainly.
Wonderful, thank you. So the question that has been posted is, what would you recommend in terms of medical school training to create resistance to participation in genocide?
I'm not sure. One thing that I would do is include in college education a compulsory course on the participation of your chosen profession in genocide. Some 20% of the high-ranking SS officers were graduates of law departments from prestigious German and Austrian universities. I would make studying their careers a compulsory element of legal education anywhere. German anthropologists started their academic study of races in what is today Namibia. In fact, they commissioned the German army in Namibia to send them appropriate amounts of skulls for further study. Students trained by those anthropologists produced the academic definitions of Roma and Jews and made sure that they're being implemented. I would make studying this a part of the curriculum of any anthropology department in the world. The writers who justified Stalinism and eulogized the great leader, fully knowing that he has the blood of millions on his hands, are co-responsible. I would make the study of their literature part of any literature course at any university, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure if you can actually motivate someone to take the unspeakable risks that people had to take in occupied Poland, in Rwanda under the Genocidaire, in Ottoman Turkey, to save victims. But at least, we should make it easier for those of us who do not have the heroic courage it takes, not to participate. What Jews hiding in Poland desperately expected from their compatriots was not heroism. Everybody knew it's not fair to expect that. They expected indifference. They expected that nobody will notice and point out to the next door person in the tram, that guy looks Jewish, you know. That people would have the basic solidarity of not participating in genocide. And I believe that an understanding of how easy it is to convince people to become génocidaires would heighten awareness and, yes, possibly save lives.
Thank you. Thank you, Konstanty. There are more questions coming in as we speak, but I think we need to finish now. And we're very, very appreciative of your time this evening, and again of all your work on this subject. So thank you, Konstanty. Please accept our best wishes from here, from sunny Cape Town, for the winter that is coming to Poland. Best of luck to you and all our friends in Poland, and thank you again for joining us and delivering this very thoughtful, provoking discussion, this speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, and I just hope it might be useful. Take care.
I'm sure it will. Thank you,
Wonderful.
Mary.
Thank you, Konstanty.
Take care.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.